For 28 years, the world believed we were gone, that 5 young women had vanished into a stormy night, erased by wind and rain and whispers. Some said, we ran away with men. Others claimed we were dead, lost to the sea, to madness, to sin. But no one ever imagined the real reason, because the truth was far too horrifying. I am Grace, 70 years old now, with more ghosts than years behind me. And for the first time, I will speak. I will tell the story no one else lived long enough to finish. This is not a story about losing faith. It is a story about surviving evil dressed in sacred robes, about 5 women who gave their youth to God, only to discover that hell can hide behind stained glass and the scent of incense. It is about silence, how it strangles, how it protects the wrong people, and how, sometimes, the only way to stay alive is to run so far from your name that you forget it belonged to you once. Since childhood, I was the quiet one. I watched more than I spoke. My mother used to say, I saw too much. Grace notices what others don't. Maybe that's why it was me who caught the first signs. The flickers of shadow, where light should have been, the way his eyes lingered too long, the hush that fell like a shroud when his footsteps echoed through the stone halls. I wish I hadn't noticed. I wish I could have been blind like the rest, but I wasn't. And once you see a devil behind a cross, you can never unsee it. I entered the convent, at 16, voluntarily, eager, pure-hearted, you might say. I wanted to serve something bigger than myself. I longed for structure, peace, and the sacred rhythm of prayer. In those early years, I found exactly what I sought. The convent gave shape to my days and serenity to my soul. The bells, the gardens, the routine, it all felt like a gentle lullaby from heaven. I belonged. At least, I thought I did. There were 5 of us then. Just 5 nuns tucked away in the hills of Havenwood. A town so small that even its silence had an echo. Our lives were simple and reverent. Mother Agnes led us with a firm, loving hand. She was the kind of woman who could scold you and bless you in the same breath. I trusted her. We all did. She kept us safe. And then one day, Father Michael arrived. He was a tall man with a voice like thunder. Charismatic, commanding, people adored him instantly. They said he brought energy to the parish, renewal. But behind that booming voice, there was something else. A presence that made the air feel thick. I remember the first time I met him in person. His gaze was so direct, it felt like he was reading my soul, but not with love, with hunger. I didn't know what to call it then. I do now. At first, it was subtle. A hand resting too long on a shoulder, questions during confession, that seemed more curious than compassionate. He wanted to know things no priest had any business asking. Things about our thoughts, our bodies, our pasts, and he always asked, with a smile that looked pious, but never reached his eyes. That smile haunts me still. Sarah was the first to withdraw. She was just 19, still shy in her robes, still unsure in her steps. I noticed her flinch when he entered a room. How she stopped sitting in the front pew. How her voice trembled when she said his name. I tried to ask her once if something was wrong, but she only looked at the floor and whispered, I can't say. That night, I barely slept. A deep, cold certainty had settled in my bones. Then Mother Agnes fell ill. Pneumonia, they said. She took to her bed and never returned to the chapel. Without her presence, the atmosphere shifted. It was as if the walls themselves recoiled, and into that vacuum stepped Father Michael, now our unchallenged guide, our spiritual protector. His visits became more frequent, his sermons more intense, the air grew heavier, and the silence we once cherished became a prison. One afternoon, I entered the library and saw something that turned my blood to ice. Sarah, cornered between the shelves, her wrist held tightly by Father Michael, her eyes wide, his voice low and firm. She saw me, and for a moment, I saw something break in her, a cry that never made it to sound. I stood there, frozen, as he let her go, and turned to greet me as if nothing had happened. That night, I lay in bed with my hands clenched so tight my nails left marks on my palms. I knew something was terribly wrong. I just didn't know yet how far it would go, or how far we would have to go to escape it. I woke the next morning to the sound of rain tapping against the narrow window above my bed. The kind of gentle, persistent drizzle that softens everything it touches. But there was nothing soft about the pit in my stomach. It had taken root overnight, fed by what I had seen in the library. Sarah didn't speak of it. She moved through the morning rituals with the same practiced devotion, but her hands trembled when she held the chalice, and her eyes never rose above the floor. I watched her closely. I began to watch all of us. I approached Eleanor in the garden that afternoon. She was pruning the basil, her hands precise and methodical as always. "I saw something yesterday," I said carefully. She didn't answer, just kept cutting. I waited. Then, without looking at me, she said, "So did I." Her voice was thin, almost inaudible. That was the beginning. The first thread pulled from a tapestry none of us dared unravel before. Eleanor, the most analytical among us, was the first to break the sacred silence. After that conversation, something changed in her. Her silence wasn't frozen anymore. It was active, listening, analyzing. She began asking quiet questions, observing. It was she, not I, who first whispered the word that would shape everything that came next. Proof. It wasn't enough to suspect, we needed evidence. Cold, undeniable truth. Because what we were up against wasn't just a man, it was a system designed to protect him. From that day forward, I began recording in my mind every glance, every inappropriate gesture, every carefully crafted manipulation. I noticed how Father Michael orchestrated moments of privacy, how he would call us individually to the sacristy or the library, always under the guise of spiritual guidance. I noticed how his touch, always too casual, began to stray, how his voice, so authoritative in public, turned coaxing and cruel in private. Sister Joy, our Joy, who had once laughed like wind chimes in summer, began to fade. Her brightness dimmed slowly, like a candle burning at both ends. One day, she came to me after evening prayers, her face blotchy and her hands shaking. "He grabbed me," she said. Just that, a whisper, like a dying flame. And then she cried, not with the heaving sobs of a child, but with the stifled grief of someone who knows no one will come to save her. Mother Agnes was still too ill to intervene. The structure that held us together was crumbling, and in its absence, the wolf walked freely among the sheep. And no one from the outside saw it. Because Father Michael was beloved. He preached fire and grace on Sundays. He kissed babies and blessed the old. He was their vision of holiness, and we were merely its shadow, and who listens to a shadow? I began to change. Quietly. Internally. I started writing things down. Dates, times, words. I kept it hidden inside a prayer book. Eleanor did the same. We became a secret alliance, a resistance cloaked in veils. But we were not soldiers. We were frightened women who had given their lives to God, and now found ourselves prisoners inside his supposed house. The convent, once our sanctuary, had become a cage, a beautiful one, but a cage all the same. Sarah was disappearing in front of us, her body thinner, her eyes vacant. One night, I found her curled in the pantry, her knees drawn to her chest, whispering prayers under her breath. When I touched her shoulder, she flinched so violently, I nearly cried. "He says if I speak, I'll go to hell," she murmured. Her voice had no weight. It was as if it had been scraped raw. That was the night I felt something snap inside me. Something maternal, something sacred, something furious. I went to Mother Agnes the next morning. I begged her to listen, but her face turned hard. "How dare you accuse a man of God of such things?" she said through fevered breath. "Go pray for your soul, Grace." And that was when I understood. We were utterly alone. The system would not save us. The hierarchy would not hear us. And if we wanted to survive, we would have to do what none of us had ever considered. We would have to leave everything behind. The seed of escape was planted that day. It was not a scream. It was a whisper. A word passed between frightened hands, in the cellar. A glance exchanged at morning prayer. A thread of hope wrapped in terror. At first, I thought it was impossible. But then I looked at Sarah, at Joy, at Eleanor's steady eyes, at the way even Martha had begun to sleep with her door locked. And I realized we were already lost. The only choice left was whether we would be lost forever, or fight to be found again. The St. Mary of Peace convent looked like something out of a painting. Gray stone walls covered in ivy, narrow windows that filtered the light into soft gold, a garden in the back that smelled of lavender and damp soil. People used to say it was the closest thing to heaven on earth. They had no idea that behind those quiet walls, hell had made a home. Evil doesn't arrive with fire and horns. It seeps in softly, dressed in white robes and scripture. Our days were always the same. We rose before dawn. The bells rang at 5, their chimes echoing over the fog that blanketed the hills. We prayed together, in Latin and in silence. Then we went about our assigned duties. Some in the kitchen, others in the chapel. Some like me in the vegetable garden. The rhythm gave us purpose. At least it used to, before the silence turned from sacred to suffocating. I found God in the soil. There was something about digging my fingers into the earth that made me feel anchored, even when everything else began to float away. The smell of basil, the slow growth of carrots, the way the rainwater clung to cabbage leaves like pearls. Sarah worked beside me, sometimes humming softly, sometimes quiet as the wind. We never spoke much in the garden, but there was comfort in the silence between us. That silence would later become a lifeline. Each sister had her place. Eleanor, always the scholar, spent hours in the library, reading theological texts. Her mind was a fortress, logical, sharp, relentless. She often quoted scripture, like others quoted breath. Joy, as her name promised, brought light. She taught catechism to the village children, her laughter bright and contagious. Martha, the eldest, ruled the kitchen like a general kneading bread with strength and grace. Her bread had soul, and Sarah was still learning, still tender, still untouched by the world she had just entered, until Father Michael touched her world with fire. When he first came, he brought gifts, a book for Eleanor, a tiny Virgin Mary statue for the chapel, seeds for the garden. People called it generosity. I now know it was strategy. He came into our space like a shepherd, observing, smiling, waiting. But a shepherd doesn't ask his sheep about their bodies in confession. A shepherd doesn't linger too long behind you, while you're bent over the garden bed. A shepherd doesn't look at a girl like Sarah the way he did. Sarah changed. Her brightness dulled. She no longer sang when she watered the roses. One morning, I found her holding a trowel like it was a weapon. I touched her shoulder, and she flinched, as if struck. "What did he do to you?" I whispered. She didn't answer, she just began to cry, the kind of cry that doesn't come from the throat, but from the bones. That's when I knew. It had happened. It had truly happened. I tried again to speak to Mother Agnes. She was sicker by then, weak and pale, tucked under layers of wool. When I told her what I suspected, she looked at me as though I had blasphemed. "A priest is a vessel of God, Grace," she said coldly. "You must examine your conscience, not his." I left her room that day, and never returned. I knew then she would not be our shield anymore. Father Michael grew bolder. He began to isolate each of us in subtle ways. Small instructions, separate assignments, special spiritual discussions. He sowed confusion, guilt, and fear like a farmer planting poison. I started intercepting his requests, asking for the younger sisters during hours when I could be there too. But he noticed. One day he confronted me directly, his smile thin and tight. "You're watching me, aren't you, Sister Grace?" I didn't answer. I just looked back at him and said nothing. I think that silence was the first thing he feared. He began spreading rumors. That I was disobedient, that I was struggling with impure thoughts, that I was destabilizing the harmony of the convent. Sister Martha, who had once smiled at me every morning, now watched me from the corner of her eye. Doubt had already begun its work. The system that was supposed to protect us turned inward like a blade, and I realized then, we couldn't ask for help. We would have to find our own escape route, a way out of the stone garden we once believed was paradise. We started meeting in the cellar, 5 nuns beneath the earth, whispering between crates of canned peaches and sacks of flour. We spoke in fragments, in sighs, in scripture, twisted into secret plans. "God helps those who help themselves," Joy said once, half smiling through tears. "Maybe he's waiting on us." That night, I lay awake and asked myself a question that still echoes inside me. What does it mean to betray your vows when those vows are the very chains keeping you from saving a life? There's a kind of fear that doesn't shake your hands. It stills them. A silence, so thick, it becomes a second skin. That's what the convent became, in those final weeks before we escaped. Fear wasn't an emotion anymore. It was an atmosphere, a fog that led in the halls, clinging to the hymn books, the rosary beads, the very fabric of our habits. And yet we had to keep moving through it, smiling when visitors arrived, singing hymns that no longer reached heaven, pretending we still believed the building was holy. After Mother Agnes fell too ill to stand, Father Michael took full control. Officially, he was just assisting. In reality, he was watching us, splitting us up, calling Sarah to the sacristy, summoning Joy for private confession, leaving notes for Eleanor on the margins of her Bible. He was weaving a net, and we were each caught in it differently. But it was Sarah who suffered most. The youngest, the quietest, the one he believed would break first. She began to vanish from the inside out. One morning, I found her in the hallway, her habit disheveled, her cheek bearing a faint red mark in the shape of fingers. Her mouth trembled when she whispered. He said, "I'm just a girl in a robe that God gave me to him to keep pure." I held her then, tightly, like I could pull her pain into my chest and carry it for her. But how do you carry the weight of evil that wears a crucifix and calls itself holy? I tried again to reason with Eleanor. "We have to do something," I said, gripping her wrist. She looked at me with weary eyes, the kind that had seen too much logic, too many dead ends. "What will we do, Grace?" she asked. "Speak to a bishop who will tell us to pray harder. Go to the town and accuse a priest beloved by all?" She wasn't being cruel, she was being honest. That was the horror of it. There was no path forward that wasn't also a fall. Joy broke next. Her laughter, which once lifted every corner of the convent, had vanished. Her eyes were swollen from tears. She didn't explain. One night she came into my room and stood there. Just stood, until I asked what happened. "He questioned my chastity," she said quietly, "said he could feel my sins when I walked into the chapel." And then she pulled up her sleeve. A bruise, purple and yellow, bloomed across her forearm. "He didn't like that I tried to leave. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The rage that rose in me was cold, not hot, focused. I began writing everything down. Dates, times, phrases. I memorized the way he moved, the moments he struck, the patterns in his manipulation. If no one would believe our voices, I would create a record too heavy to ignore. Eleanor joined me. Her writings were even more detailed, clinical, almost. The mind of a woman who'd stopped praying and started documenting. Then one night, everything changed. Sarah came to my room, sobbing, clutching her torn sleeve. "He told me, in the confessional, I had to give myself to him, that it was penance." I stared at her and realized we had reached the point of no return. This wasn't just manipulation, it was destruction. And I would not let him destroy one more soul. "This ends tonight," I said. My voice was calm, but my hands trembled with the fury of every buried scream. The next morning, I requested permission to go into town to fetch supplies for the infirmary. As I had done many times before, it was the only freedom we had left. Underneath my robes, I hid Eleanor's notes and my own. Wrapped in an old handkerchief, I walked to the parish offices with the weight of 4 lives in my pocket. And a prayer not for mercy, but for justice. I waited for 3 hours before they let me in. The bishop looked tired, disinterested. When I told him everything, he listened in silence. When I showed him the notes, he read them slowly. Then he sighed. "These are serious claims, Sister Grace. Father Michael is a respected priest. Are you certain?" That sentence, so rehearsed, so sterile, almost made me scream. "I am certain," I said. "And if you do nothing, the next time I come here, it will be to place a dead girl at your feet." He promised to investigate. Told me to keep quiet, not to create scandal. He would handle it with discretion. I left feeling both relieved and doomed. 2 nights later, Father Michael returned to the convent, after hours. His face was twisted in something beyond anger. He called Eleanor into his office. She was gone for nearly an hour. When she emerged, her face was gray, her eyes hollow. He passed me on the stairs and whispered, "God punishes liars." That's when I knew the bishop had betrayed me. Told him everything. That night, Eleanor came to my room. "They think you're unstable," she said. "He told them you're disobedient, that you've invented all this out of some delusion." The walls had officially closed in. I was no longer just a witness. I was now the target. The next morning, I was summoned to the office. Father Michael was already there, standing by the window with the confidence of a man who believes he is untouchable. He held a letter in his hand, the bishop's decision. His voice was honeyed with cruelty as he read it aloud. I was to be transferred immediately to a remote convent in Montana. For emotional instability, for defamatory behavior, and most insulting of all, for spiritual rebellion. He smirked with every word, savoring them like wine. I didn't speak. I simply stood there, absorbing each insult like nails into my spine. When I walked out, I felt a strange kind of quiet, not peace. Something deeper, a clarity that felt like thunder behind my ribs. I knew then that I would not be going to Montana. I would not disappear into another convent while Sarah stayed behind to be broken in secret. If the institution would not protect us, then I would have to become something I never imagined, a fugitive from the church I had given my life to. I went to the cellar that evening, where the air smelled of earth and rust and old prayers. One by one, the others joined me. I told them everything, the transfer, the lies, the betrayal. We have to go, I said. Tonight, if we must. At first, there was only silence. And then Martha, the eldest, who had rarely spoken since Mother Agnes fell ill, looked up with a gaze as steady as stone. If it's the only way to keep them safe, I'll climb that wall myself. It wasn't a plan yet. It was just a prayer in the shape of a whisper. But Eleanor took it and made it real. She started asking questions about documents, about clothes, about the structure of the wall. We sat there, surrounded by potatoes and prayer candles, and began to map our way out of the only life we had ever known. It wasn't courage that moved us. It was desperation, braided with love. The convent wall was tall and cruel. At its top were shards of glass set into the mortar, meant to keep intruders out, but now threatening to keep us in. The gates were locked at night, and the sound of them opening would wake even the most deaf of sisters. There was only one place the wall curved downward, near the old oak tree behind the garden, where the stone had begun to crumble. If there was a chance, it was there. We needed help. Someone outside. Someone who could drive us far enough away that they wouldn't find us before dawn. I didn't know who to trust, but I began to pray, not with words but with need. And that's when Mr. Miller became the answer. He was the man who delivered vegetables to the convent twice a week. A simple, weathered man who rarely spoke. But that day, as I helped him unload a crate of squash, he looked at me differently. "You don't look well, Sister Grace," he said softly. His voice was like a key slipping into a forgotten lock. I told him nothing at first, but he nodded anyway. "My daughter, she was a nun too, long ago. Something happened to her. Something no one believed. If you ever need anything," his voice cracked. "Anything." That was the moment I knew. I told him everything in a low whisper, just enough for him to understand the gravity. He didn't ask for details. He didn't blink. He only said, "Tell me what to do." Over the next few days, he became our lifeline. We left him notes folded into the lettuce leaves. He mapped out a plan. A rope ladder hidden beneath the hedge. A pickup truck waiting on the dirt road past the hill, and a cousin in North Carolina who owned a small inn and asked no questions. "It won't be easy," he said in his final note. "But it's possible, and I won't let him take one more of you." Eleanor retrieved our birth certificates from the archives. Joy packed medications. Sarah and I stitched plain clothes from discarded fabric, since we couldn't risk being seen in our habits. Martha said nothing, but donated her only luxury, a family photo album that she chose to leave behind. "You can't carry the past and the future at the same time," she whispered. The night before we fled, the rain came like a benediction, thick, relentless, and blessedly loud. It covered every sound, the clink of glass, the scraping of shoes on stone, the tearing of cloth. At midnight, we gathered in the cellar one last time. We folded our habits neatly and placed them on the table like offerings. I looked around at the women I had lived beside for years, and for the first time I didn't see nuns. I saw survivors. And then we ran, soaked, trembling, breathless, not just toward freedom, but toward the terrifying unknown of life beyond the convent walls. The rain fell so hard, it felt like penance. It soaked our clothes, our skin, our bones, until we could no longer tell if we were crying or if the sky was doing it for us. I was the first over the wall, the rough stone tearing my palms. As I climbed, Joy came next, her hands shaking as she gripped the rope ladder made from old sheets. Sarah followed, silent, except for her trembling breath. Eleanor climbed, like a woman escaping fire, and Martha, brave Martha, struggled last, her body old, but her will unshakable. When she reached the top, she didn't look down, she just whispered, "Thank you, God," and dropped into the mud with the rest of us. We didn't speak. Not once. We just ran, across the garden we once tended with prayer, past the chapel that once echoed with our hymns, through the darkness of the field behind the convent, our feet slipping in the wet grass, hearts beating like war drums in our chests. We looked like ghosts fleeing a graveyard. Perhaps we were. Mr. Miller was waiting, his truck tucked into a curve of the road, like a secret. The back was covered with a tarp. Eleanor, Joy, and Sarah crawled in first. Martha and I sat up front beside him, our hands folded in our laps, as if prayer could still hold this together. He didn't ask questions, didn't speak, just looked ahead with eyes that had seen enough suffering to understand that silence was sometimes the greatest mercy. The ride felt like eternity. The rain pounded the roof above us, the windows fogged with our breath. Every time we passed headlights, I braced myself for red and blue lights, for sirens, for judgment, for the sound of heaven closing its gates behind us. But no one stopped us. No one looked twice, and I thought, perhaps even God was holding his breath, waiting to see if we would make it. We didn't go far that night. Just 20 miles outside Havenwood, to a barn on Mr. Miller's brother-in-law's land. A place no one visited. It smelled of hay and oil and damp wood. There were blankets and canned food, an old lantern, and a corner swept clean of dust. "It's not much," he said, as we climbed out of the truck. "But it's yours." We stood in a line, soaked and shivering, staring at a future we couldn't yet imagine. Inside, we dried ourselves off in silence. Eleanor passed out the blankets. Joy lit the lantern. Sarah curled up in a ball and cried without sound. Martha knelt and whispered a prayer, one hand clutching the rosary she hadn't had the heart to leave behind. I stood by the barn door, watching the night like it might change its mind. I didn't feel safe. Not yet. But I felt something else. Something like the beginning of becoming human again. That night we slept in layers on the floor, our bodies pressed together for warmth, like sisters in the womb of something new. I barely closed my eyes. My mind was a river of questions. Would they find us? Would they punish Mr. Miller? Would they call us heretics, traitors, liars? I didn't care, not really. The only thing I feared was waking up in chains, waking up to find that it had all been a dream, and that I was still trapped inside the convent walls. Dawn came slowly, wrapped in gray. The world looked the same, but everything in me had changed. I watched the light stretch across the floorboards, thinking of the chapel windows back home, how they used to color the morning sun with pink and gold. Here there was only the soft gray of survival, no sacred art, no incense. Just us. 5 women who had dared to say no in a place that only allowed yes. Mr. Miller returned that afternoon, with fresh bread and clothing. Civilian clothes, denim, cotton, lace, things we hadn't worn in decades, things we barely recognized as ours. It felt like shedding skin. I looked at myself in the mirror of a broken compact he brought, and I didn't know who stared back. But for the first time, the woman in the reflection wasn't afraid. She looked tired, hollow, but she looked free. That night, we made the decision to move forward. Mr. Miller's cousin in North Carolina had agreed to take us in. He would send a larger truck. No questions asked. And so we began rehearsing our new names, our new lives. Linda, Emily, Rose, Catherine, Millie. It felt like blasphemy at first, like burying the women we once were. But it was the only way to keep those women alive. We weren't abandoning Sister Grace, Sister Sarah, Sister Joy. We were carrying them with us into a world that would never know how much they had to give up, just to survive. The following morning, the air smelled of damp straw and firewood. Mr. Miller's cousin, Sam, arrived just before sunrise, driving a delivery truck big enough to hide us among crates and boxes. He didn't speak much, just nodded when introduced. His wife, Mary, brought a thermos of coffee and a paper bag filled with sandwiches. She looked at us with quiet, knowing eyes. The kind that didn't ask questions because the answers would only deepen the pain. I could tell by the way she touched Sarah's shoulder that she understood more than she let on. We climbed into the back of the truck, one by one, helping Martha last. There were no seats, just crates and old furniture covered in sheets. It smelled of varnish and dust. But to us, it might as well have been sanctuary. Sam closed the doors gently. For a moment, darkness swallowed us again. But this time, it wasn't prison. It was protection. We held hands in silence as the engine started, each bump in the road shaking loose a piece of the life we'd left behind. The journey took most of the day. None of us spoke. Every sound outside, sirens, horns, voices, felt like a threat. I could hear Eleanor reciting psalms under her breath. Joy's hand trembled in mine. Sarah dozed off against my shoulder, her breath uneven. I stared at the wooden panels above us and imagined what it might feel like to have a name again that wasn't drenched in fear. I didn't know if such a name existed. When we finally arrived, the air was thick with pine and damp earth. The inn was small, tucked between two ridges, surrounded by woods and quiet roads. Mary and Sam helped us settle in, giving us 2 rooms at the back. No IDs, no sign-ins, just keys and warm food. That night, as we sat on creaking beds, we rehearsed our lies like sinners learning scripture backwards. I became Linda Peterson, a schoolteacher. Sarah, now Emily, my younger sister. Eleanor and Joy were cousins. Martha was our widowed aunt. It was surreal. I tried on the name like a coat that didn't fit. Linda, I whispered into the bathroom mirror. It didn't echo like Sister Grace once had. It didn't carry the same weight of purpose, but it also didn't carry the same burden. It was safer. And that, I realized, was the point. We weren't trying to become anyone. We were trying not to be found. The days passed slowly. But they passed. Mary fed us, and never asked how we slept. I think she already knew we didn't. We helped her with chores. Joy in the kitchen, Eleanor with repairs, me in the laundry room, where I could cry into the steam without anyone asking why. Sarah was quiet most of the time, often sitting near the fireplace, twisting her rosary between trembling fingers. She was still healing. We all were. And healing, we learned, wasn't a prayer. It was a choice you had to make. Every morning you woke up breathing. Eventually we moved on. Again. Sam knew someone in Cleveland who ran a small garment factory. No paperwork. No questions. Just work. We boarded another truck, left the inn behind, and started over. Again. The factory was loud, crowded, and exhausting, but the hum of sewing machines was its own kind of silence. One that didn't hurt. We learned to live with less fear. Some days, less hope, on others. But always, less of who we had once been. Cleveland became our hiding place for years. We found a house in a quiet neighborhood, paid rent in cash, used fake names at the grocery store. Every task was a performance, every smile, a defense. But slowly, the performances began to feel less like lies, and more like layers of skin we could survive in. Eleanor, ever the learner, was promoted to supervisor. Joy made friends with neighbors. Sarah found a bookstore she loved. And I began to believe that survival could also be sacred. The hardest part wasn't the hiding. It was what we had to leave behind. The rituals, the vows, the structure that once gave our lives meaning. I missed the bells, the morning prayers, the sound of Joy's laughter in the chapel before we lit the candles. I missed Sister Grace, not the title, but the purpose. But in those years, I began to understand something deeper. Maybe God wasn't confined to cloisters and crucifixes. Maybe he lived in hidden rooms, in whispered strength, in the hands of women who chose to live when death would have been easier. And still, every time I heard a man's voice behind me in a store, I turned to make sure it wasn't him. Every time the doorbell rang, my heart stopped. Fear, even when quiet, has roots. And ours had grown deep. Time passed differently in hiding. It didn't tick, it ached. The calendar pages changed. Yes, but the weight of memory never lightened. We moved like ghosts through a city that never knew our names. Built lives from scratch, with hands still shaking from what they had endured. Cleveland became our shelter, our prison, our purgatory. No one knew we had once worn habits. No one knew we had once given our lives to God. And that was exactly how it had to be. We worked 6 days a week sewing uniforms. The sound of machines became our prayer, each stitch a tether to the present, each hem a distraction from the past. Eleanor thrived in the structure. She took charge of inventory, managed other women, wore her new identity like armor, joy as she softened. She began to smile again, though the laughter never reached her eyes. Sarah kept mostly to herself, still haunted, still too fragile for the world. And Martha, our steady wrinkled anchor, grew slower with each passing year. In 1983, we lost her. It happened in the kitchen while she was slicing bread. A stroke. Silent, sudden, and cruel. We found her on the floor, one hand still clutching a knife, the other stretched toward the window like she had seen something she wanted to reach before she left. We buried her under the name Amelia Peterson, a name that meant nothing, a life that history would forget. There was no procession, no eulogy, no chapel full of prayers, just a grave with a name that wasn't hers, and 5 women weeping in silence. Something broke in us after Martha died. The grief was heavy, but it wasn't just for her. It was for all of it, for the lives we had to erase, for the women we used to be, for the church that chose to protect power instead of people. Joy didn't speak for days. Sarah locked herself in her room. Eleanor didn't cry. She just worked more. And I found myself staring at the walls at night, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. We had survived. Yes, but what had we become? Not long after, an opportunity came. The factory opened a new branch in Charlotte, North Carolina. Eleanor was offered a manager position. We accepted without hesitation. We packed up our lives, changed addresses, and disappeared once again. Charlotte was bigger, louder, easier to vanish in. We found a new house in a quiet neighborhood, and tried, again, to begin again. But the past followed us, always. In Charlotte, the news was harder to avoid. One day, in 1994, I saw his face in the local paper, Father Michael, now Monsignor Michael, celebrating 30 years of service. The article praised him as a community pillar, a spiritual father, a man of honor. There was even a photograph, his hair grayer, his face more lined, but still wearing that same smug, sanctified smile. I ran to the bathroom and vomited. Rage filled every hollow space in me. How had he not only escaped justice, but risen? While we lived in shadows and whispered false names, he stood at altars and received praise. While we mourned behind closed doors, he built a legacy on silence. I showed the article to Eleanor. She stared at it for a long time, then folded it slowly and put it in her desk drawer. "We gave up everything," she whispered, "and he gave up nothing." Not long after, Eleanor began to cough. It started as a cold, then it lingered. The diagnosis came quietly, like everything else in our lives. Late-stage cancer. It was as if the weight of silence had finally settled in her chest and refused to let go. We took turns sitting by her hospital bed, watching the strongest of us fade away. On one of her last days, she took my hand and said, "Promise me, Grace, promise me that one day the truth will be told, that he won't be remembered as a saint." I promised. With tears in my eyes and a war in my heart, I promised. Eleanor passed away. 2 weeks later. The room felt colder after she left, as if even the air couldn't bear the loss. We buried her quietly, modestly, under the name Catherine Blake. I watched the earth fall onto a casket that held more than a body. It held a history, a silence, and the weight of an entire institution's failure. And I knew then, the promise I made, would not die with her. After Eleanor's funeral, the silence in our house took on a different shape. It wasn't the silence of hiding anymore. It was the silence of absence, of a missing voice, a missing gaze that once held us together. Without her, everything felt less structured. Our prayers became softer, our dinners quieter. Joy tried to keep us anchored, always reminding us to pray before meals, to light candles on Sundays. But even she seemed adrift, as if Eleanor had been the compass for us all. Sarah, now Emily to the world, married a kind man she met at the factory. A quiet man, gentle and patient. I watched her blossom into a new kind of strength. She had children, built a life, a family. She moved just 10 blocks away and came by often, bringing the laughter of toddlers with her. but there were still nights when she'd arrive at my doorstep with red eyes and trembling hands. "I had the dream again," she'd whisper. "He found me," and I would hold her like I once did, in the pantry, humming hymns to hush the memory. Joy stayed with me. Two aging women in a rented house filled with other people's furniture and memories that didn't belong to us. She never fully recovered from the trauma, though she carried it well. Graceful, smiling. But her heart began to fail her. Slowly and silently, the way quiet things tend to. She passed away in 2003, in her sleep, on a rainy Tuesday morning. I found her with her hands folded and a faint smile on her lips, as if she'd finally forgiven the world for what it did to her. Her death left just me and Sarah, and I began to wonder if the story, the truth, would ever find its voice again. The weight of Eleanor's promise had grown heavier with each passing year. I often found myself staring at the worn leather notebook she left behind. Inside, her handwriting still danced in steady, deliberate lines, dates, names, incidents, warnings, and at the end, a message for me. "Do not let this die with us. Wait for the right moment. And when it comes, do not be silent." In 2005, the factory closed. The final curtain on that chapter. I used my savings to move once more. This time to a quiet town nestled at the base of the North Carolina mountains. I bought a small house with peeling paint and a garden that reminded me of the convent before the shadows came. I opened a sewing shop. Linda Peterson, shopkeeper. No one asked about the past. I became the quiet woman who hemmed prom dresses and stitched curtains, who smiled politely and kept to herself. Sarah visited often. Her children called me Aunt Linda. They never knew the truth. I sometimes caught her watching me with a mix of gratitude and guilt, like she knew I was carrying something she couldn't anymore. One day, she said, "Promise me you'll never tell them, my kids. I want them to know peace." I promised, but inside, another fire began to smolder, because I had made a different promise too to Eleanor. And silence, I had come to realize, was a kind of death. Then came 207. I read in the diocesan bulletin that Monsignor Michael, yes, he was still alive, still cloaked in ceremony, had suffered a mild stroke. He was no longer preaching regularly. A new young priest had been appointed to assist him. His name was Father John, a former university professor, known for working with at-risk youth, progressive, curious. And in one interview, when asked what inspired his vocation, he mentioned his sister, a nun, a good woman, who died too young. That name was never printed. But I knew. Something in my chest cracked open. I clipped the article and held it in my hands like a signal from heaven. Was this the moment Eleanor had spoken of? A voice inside the church, who might finally listen, not to destroy, but to restore. I sat with that question for weeks, watching the light shift through my window, listening to the wind run its fingers through the pine trees. Then one day, I folded the newspaper, tucked Eleanor's notebook into my bag, and took the bus to Havenwood. The town had changed. The faces were younger, the buildings newer, but the scent of pine and the weight in the air were the same. I found Father John's parish office tucked beside the new chapel. I knocked once. He opened the door, and when he asked how he could help me, I took a long breath, looked him in the eye, and said, "My name is not Linda Peterson. I am Sister Grace, and I have a story to tell you." Father John did not flinch when I spoke. He looked at me with curiosity first, then recognition, like someone realizing a story they'd heard in passing was suddenly sitting in their office, made flesh in memory. "Sister Grace?" he said softly, almost reverently. "You're real?" I nodded. He stepped aside without another word and motioned for me to sit. The door clicked shut behind me, and just like that, the silence I had worn for 28 years began to come undone. I placed the notebook on his desk with both hands. "This belonged to Sister Eleanor," I said. "She was the mind of our group, the one who saw every thread. She recorded everything, every date, every moment, every warning ignored." He opened it slowly, his fingers trembling. As he flipped through the pages, I watched his face change. Curiosity, giving way to horror, then sorrow. "My sister," he murmured, "was a nun too." I wonder now if he didn't finish. The silence spoke for him. And then I told him about the early joy of convent life, About the garden and the chapel and the sisters whose laughter once filled the halls. I told him how Father Michael arrived, how he broke us one by one, how he twisted confession into a trap, spoke of Sarah's trembling, Joy's fading, Martha's stroke. I spoke of Eleanor's strength, and my own helpless rage. I told him about the escape, the rain, the rope ladder, the truck. I didn't cry. I spoke with a clarity that had taken a lifetime to sharpen. He listened, not just with his ears, but with something deeper. His hands remained on the notebook the whole time, like it was anchoring him to the story. When I finished, he looked up with wet eyes. "I'm so sorry," he said, "for all of it, for the church's silence, for every person who turned away, and for what it cost you to carry this alone." It wasn't absolution, it was recognition. And that, in that moment, was the holiest thing I'd ever received. But the fire wasn't done burning. "It's not just about me," I said, "or even my sisters. It's about him. He's still here, still honored, still hiding behind vestments and titles." I paused, pressing my hands together to steady them. "I need someone to help me tell the truth, someone they might believe." Father John met my eyes. "Then you've come to the right place," he said. "I will help you." In the days that followed, we met in secret. He contacted a bishop he trusted, a younger man with a reputation for confronting abuse, not hiding it. Together, they read Eleanor's notebook, checked dates, cross-referenced names. They found buried correspondence letters from other superiors, records of warnings that had never been acted on. It was all there, evidence not only of Father Michael's crimes, but of the church's willful ignorance. I was terrified the entire time. Every time the phone rang, every time a door creaked, I expected him to walk in, to stare me down with those eyes that had once made me feel like I would vanish if I spoke. But instead, it was the bishop who came, a tall man with tired eyes and a grave kindness in his voice. After I told him everything, he stood from his chair, knelt in front of me, and said, "On behalf of the church, I ask for your forgiveness. You were failed, repeatedly, and now we must make it right." 2 weeks later, Monsignor Michael returned from medical leave. He arrived at the rectory with his usual entourage of respect and tradition, but this time, we were ready. When he entered the meeting room and saw me sitting beside Father John and the bishop, his expression cracked for just a second. "You," he said. I met his gaze without blinking. "Yes," I replied. "Me. The one you tried to erase." He denied everything. Of course, called me unstable, delusional, vindictive, accused me of conspiring with a liberal priest and a power-hungry bishop. But the weight of Eleanor's notebook, the records we had uncovered, and the emerging testimonies of others, some who had remained silent for decades, could not be dismissed. The church launched a formal investigation, and for the first time I saw the beginnings of justice. There were people who didn't believe me, who still don't. Parishioners who had adored him, women who had sung his praises, men who considered him a spiritual father. But for every doubter, there was a voice rising from the dark, saying, "I believe you." It started small. A letter slipped under the church door. A message left in Father John's mailbox. A woman I had never met, weeping in the pew, whispering, "He did it to me too." And slowly, I realized, the truth wasn't just mine anymore. It was ours. When the truth first reached the community, it didn't roar, it rippled, a tremor beneath the sanctuary floor. Whispers in the church parking lot, eyebrows raised in disbelief. A bulletin notice that something serious was being looked into. But then came the faces, real women, some aged, some younger, who had lived with their own private ghosts, and one by one, they began to speak. It started with a retired teacher, Mrs. Teresa Morera, who had known me as a teenager before I entered the convent. She stood up during a parish gathering, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her hands. "Sister Grace," she said, "I believe you, and I'm ashamed I never questioned what happened that night." Her voice cracked, but her eyes held. "We let you vanish. We let the church write your silence for you." Her words were the first domino to fall. Then came a man in his 40s, sleeves rolled up and pain in his posture. My sister was a novice at St. Mary of Peace in the 70s. She left suddenly, never told us why. Never went back to Mass. Now I wonder if she left because of him. He wiped his face and sat down, but the space he opened didn't close. It widened, letting in more air, more light, more memory, and then more stories. Little by little, our silence began to echo in other people's lives. Some rejected me outright. Their faith was married to the man, not the message. They called me bitter, delusional, accused me of slandering a holy servant out of resentment. I understood that anger, because I had lived inside it. But it didn't wound me like it once might have. I wasn't alone anymore, and I had stopped needing to be believed by everyone. I only needed to be believed by truth. Local papers picked up the story first, slowly, cautiously. Then regional ones. Then the Diocesan Review Board made a public statement, confirming the allegations were being formally investigated. Monsignor Michael was placed on administrative leave. It was a strange phrase, leave for a man who had left so many lives in ruins. But it was something, a crack in the marble, a breath in a sealed tomb. He responded the way power often does, with lawsuits and sermons laced with veiled attacks. He painted me as a disgraced nun, a symbol of rebellion, a woman who could not handle obedience. He claimed we had run off to live in sin, that I had returned with fabricated memories. But Eleanor's notebook, my testimony, the uncovered letters from old superiors, and eventually the voices of other women made his denials feel thinner with each passing week. More victims came forward. Some had been laywomen. Others were former novices who had left the church entirely. Their stories carried the same patterns, the same words, the same twisted theology used as a weapon. The church had no choice but to expand the investigation. For once, they could not bury it. The soil was too thin, the eyes too many, and the silence, it had finally broken wide open. I testified formally before a canonical board. The room was sterile, white walls, wooden chairs, men in collars, but this time, I wasn't afraid. I spoke clearly, with the strength of the dead behind me, Joy, Martha, Eleanor, and the living beside me. I told them everything. From the moment I entered the convent to the moment I climbed over its wall, I named what had never been named aloud: abuse, manipulation, desecration under the guise of devotion. At the end of my testimony, there was no applause. No priest reached for my hand. But one leaned forward, removed his glasses, and said, "You should have been heard decades ago. I am sorry for what it cost you to bring us here." I nodded, not with forgiveness, not with absolution, but with acknowledgement. It was more than I had ever expected. The investigation lasted nearly a year. When the decision was finally read, I was sitting on the same bench where I had waited as a 16-year-old postulant. This time, I was 70. My back ached. My hands were thinner. But my voice had never been clearer. Monsignor Michael was laicized, stripped of clerical authority, forbidden from serving in any religious capacity again. It wasn't prison, but it was exile. And for a man like him, exile was worse than death. When they announced the verdict, I didn't feel triumph. I felt quiet, as if something had been uncoiled deep in my chest after decades of tension, and now all that was left was stillness. Monsignor Michael, no longer father, no longer Monsignor, left Havenwood in the middle of the night, accompanied by no one, no speeches, no candles, just an old man in a car headed toward obscurity. They said he moved to Florida, to a small nursing home, where no one asked questions about his past. I did not dance when I heard the news. I did not cry. What I felt was not victory, it was gravity, the kind that settles your soul like dust finally falling after a storm. I had not wanted revenge, I had wanted truth, and truth, when it finally arrives, does not shout. It simply stands, unmoving, undeniable. Sarah came to visit me that week. We sat on the porch of my small home in the mountains, the air heavy with summer pine. She held my hand the way she used to, when she was just a frightened novice in the garden. Her eyes, older now, had regained a kind of peace. "You did it," she said. "We did it," I corrected her. But she shook her head. "I buried it. You carried it." There were parts of her that had healed in ways I couldn't understand. A family, children, a life that stretched beyond the veil of trauma. But there were also parts of her that would never heal fully. I still heard it in the way her voice faltered when she spoke of those years, still saw it in the way she stiffened when certain hymns played. Wounds fade, but they don't vanish. They shape you. They shape your voice, your silence, your faith. We walked through the garden behind the house. I had rebuilt it slowly, over the years. Rows of herbs, patches of tomatoes, and lavender. Sarah paused near a white rose bush, in bloom. "It smells like havenwood," she said softly. And for a moment, neither of us spoke. The memory hovered there, of mornings in the convent garden, before the shadow, before the fear. It was a rare kind of grief, mourning the peace that once was, before it was shattered. The church eventually made a public statement, an apology, a commitment to do better. They listed policies, task forces, prevention strategies. It was more than I ever thought I'd see. But it was also not enough, because the system had known. We had seen the margins of letters, the silent acknowledgments, the ignored warnings. The institution that now said, "Sorry," had once told me to pray away my truth. Still, I accepted the apology. Not for them, but for me. In 2009, we transformed the abandoned St. Mary of Peace convent into something new. The St. Mary of Peace Center for Women. With Father John's help, the church donated the property. Volunteers rebuilt it. Lawyers helped us secure nonprofit status. And slowly, that place once our prison became a haven. A space for women fleeing abuse. Women with nowhere else to go. The garden grew again. The chapel became a sanctuary of honesty. Not silence. People came from all over. Survivors, counselors, women who had run, just like we did, only in different ways. Some came with children. Some with bruises. Some with nothing but a name they weren't sure they could still say, out loud. And there, on those same benches where we used to sit in silence, they found their voices again. I watched it happen every day, and it reminded me that truth doesn't just expose, it heals. We installed 5 stone benches in the garden, each engraved with a name: Martha, Eleanor, Joy, Sarah, Grace. I sit on mine often, watching the sunlight dance through the leaves, and sometimes I feel them with me, not as ghosts, but as presence, as legacy. Their voices are no longer lost. They live in the laughter of the children who play near the fountain, in the hands that plant herbs where we once buried our pain, in every woman who walks through the gate and finally feels safe enough to exhale. Because justice, real justice, isn't the punishment of one man, it's the restoration of dignity, the reclaiming of voices, the rebuilding of spaces where silence used to live. And now, after decades in the shadows, I finally understand. We didn't run to escape. We ran to survive, to carry the truth forward, to plant it in soil that could one day bloom again. People often ask me now, do I still believe, after everything? After the silence, the betrayal, the exile, after watching good women die unnamed, and an abuser rise in robes, they ask if I still believe in God. And my answer always is this: more than ever. But not the God I was taught to fear, not the God cloaked in golden thread and buried behind marble. I believe in the God who held my hand in a basement, when no one else would listen, in the God who hid himself in a gardener's silence, in a stranger's kindness, in the courage we didn't know we had. Faith, I've learned, is not obedience. It is not blindness. It is not kneeling before corruption and calling it holy. True faith is fierce. It burns through lies. It breaks down walls. It tells you, get up. Even if you've been told to stay down, it whispers, you're not wrong to run when the fire comes from the altar. That kind of faith doesn't live in institutions. It lives in the blood and breath of people who still choose to love, even after love has been weaponized against them. The church failed us, but God did not. When we ran, we weren't turning away from him. We were running toward the truth, even when it hurt. Running toward the possibility of a life that didn't shrink us into silence. If anything, my faith is purer now than it ever was in the convent, because it's no longer built on fear or titles or threats of damnation. It's built on the sacred act of survival, on truth-telling, on compassion. Every morning, I walk through the garden at the center. I touch the rosemary, the lavender, the soft petals of the lilies, and I pray, not with memorized words, but with breath. Sometimes the prayer is simply thank you. Sometimes it's help her find her voice. Sometimes it's just the name of one of my sisters, spoken aloud into the wind, so they know I haven't forgotten. Women come to us broken, shattered in places they don't yet have names for, and I see in them the echoes of Sarah's shaking hands, of Joy's fading smile, of Eleanor's fire, I sit with them. I listen. And I tell them, you are not crazy. You are not weak. You are not alone. That is my ministry now, not from a pulpit, not in Latin, but eye to eye, wound to wound, truth to truth. Sometimes I speak in schools, sometimes in churches. Some places welcome me, others bristle. But I always begin the same way. I am Sister Grace. And I didn't leave the church. The church left me. I see the reaction in people's faces. Shock, discomfort, understanding. It doesn't matter, I speak anyway. Because silence is no longer my home. Father John remains in Havenwood. He turned down every promotion they offered him. My place is here, he says. In the ruins where we plant new things. He visits the center often, still listens more than he speaks. Over the years he's become not just an ally, but family, and I thank God for him often. Not the kind of thanks that's perfunctory, but the kind that aches. Sarah now volunteers full-time at the center. Her children are grown. Her voice, once so fragile, is now a balm for the younger women who enter our gates, trembling. They listen to her because they see that she knows. She doesn't speak from a textbook. She speaks from memory. And when she holds their hands, I see the light return to their faces a little faster than before. Sometimes I still wake up before dawn, expecting the convent bells to ring. I lie in bed, waiting for a sound that will never come. But then I remember where I am, who I am. I sit up slowly, whisper a prayer for each of my sisters, and begin again, not in robes, not in hiding, but in truth, in presence, in a life that after everything is still mine to live. And I realize, I didn't lose my vocation. I reclaimed it. Forgiveness was the last thing I expected to wrestle with. For years, I had assumed it was off the table. I didn't believe forgiveness was something I owed to the man who desecrated our sacred spaces, who made faith feel like a trap. I told myself that justice would have to be enough, that survival, truth-telling, and the dismantling of his legacy would be the only closure I needed. But grief, I've learned, is layered, and forgiveness is not always what we think it is. When I heard of his death, I was folding laundry. Just another ordinary day. The radio played softly in the background, a familiar local station, and then without fanfare, the announcer read the obituary. Monsignor Michael J. Renner, age 84, passed away quietly in his sleep in a Florida care home. Former spiritual leader of the Havenwood Diocese. That was it. No mention of the scandal, no hint of the pain, just a quiet erasure, like a man fading into fog. I sat down with a shirt still in my hands and stared at the floor for a long time. Not because I grieved him, but because I didn't. I felt nothing. No joy, no satisfaction, not even rage. Just a strange, distant emptiness. He had stolen so much from so many, and now, he had slipped away with no audience, no reckoning, no final breath of accountability. It felt like a story ending mid-sentence. Later that night, I lit a candle, not for him, but for me. I sat in the chapel of the center, in silence, and I asked God a question I'd avoided for decades. Am I allowed to let go? Not to excuse, not to forget, but to stop carrying him with me, because for all these years, I hadn't just carried my sisters, I had carried him too. His shadow, his voice, the echo of his threats, and I was tired. Forgiveness didn't come like a sunrise. It came like a slow thaw, over time, in pieces. It wasn't about him deserving it. He didn't. It was about me reclaiming the space he had occupied inside me. The corner of my soul that still clenched when I saw a collar, the part of my mind that flinched at hymns that reminded me of his voice. I needed to clean that out. Not for him, but for me, for Sarah, for Joy, for Eleanor, for every woman who still carries someone else's sins like luggage with no handle. I forgave him the way I forgive the storm, for ruining the garden. Not because the storm didn't do damage, but because I chose to plant again anyway. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't the opposite of justice. It's what comes after you've fought for it. It's what comes when you've done all you can, and the rest belongs to time, and truth, and God. Sometimes women at the center ask me, how do I forgive someone who never said sorry? I tell them the truth. You don't have to. Not now. Not ever, if it breaks you. Forgiveness is not a requirement for healing. But one day, You might want to stop bleeding for what someone else did. That's when forgiveness starts. And I watched their eyes soften, because permission is its own kind of salvation. Sarah asked me once if I thought he ever felt remorse, if in his final years, lying alone in that nursing home, he ever looked into the silence and saw our faces. I told her I didn't know. I never would. And maybe that was mercy, because it meant I didn't have to guess anymore. His chapter was closed. Ours was still being written. On the day of his funeral, no one came. No altar boys. No incense. No choir. Just a quiet burial handled by strangers. And I thought, how strange, how biblical that a man who once claimed to be the voice of God would be laid to rest in silence, not punished perhaps, but erased. And sometimes that's worse. I did not attend. I did not send flowers, but I did wake early that morning, walk to the edge of our garden, and say the names of my sisters, out loud, each one like a hymn. Then I said my own name, Grace, and I said it not as a prayer, but as a declaration. I am still here. I am still speaking, and I am still free. I've learned that legacy is not what's written on plaques or spoken in eulogies. It's what remains in the room after you've left. The air you changed, the silence you refused, the hand you reached for when yours was still trembling. I used to think our story would vanish with us. That time would swallow it whole, and we would become rumors, shadows, forgotten wounds. But I was wrong. Our story grows. Every time a woman walks through the center's gates and dares to tell the truth, our legacy deepens. There's a tree behind the chapel now, a tall oak we planted in memory of Eleanor. We chose it because she once told me that truth should be like an oak, slow to grow, impossible to shake, rooted in silence, but reaching for light. It stands alone, but never lonely. And every spring, when its branches stretch just a little higher, I think of her sitting at her desk, writing things no one wanted to read, and I whisper, they hear you now. Martha's name lives in the medical wing we opened last year, a place where women can heal, not just spiritually, but physically. The nurses there speak gently. No fluorescent lights. No locked doors. Just warm hands and eyes that see. When I walk through, I feel her there, in the way the staff hums old hymns, in the way they pause before touching a wound, like prayer lives in fingertips too. Joy's name is spoken every time someone finds laughter again. We started a music program in her honor. Once a week, the rooms are filled with instruments, voices, sound. Women who once forgot how to smile now sing, off-key, loud, unashamed. It's sacred noise, the kind that makes the walls remember something other than fear. Sarah and I often sit in the library, cataloging the letters we receive from across the world, survivors, sisters, strangers who felt seen. The shelves are full now, not with doctrine, but with lived testimony. One letter simply said, because of you, I didn't end my life this year. Because of you, I believe God can still be found in broken places. I read it and wept, not from sadness, but from awe. There is a girl here now, 15, quiet, eyes like winter before snow. She doesn't speak much yet, but she walks with purpose, watches everything. One day she asked if she could plant something in the garden. I handed her a trowel and said, whatever you want. She chose wildflowers, because they bloom where no one expects, she whispered. I saw myself in her, years ago, silent, small, burning. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if we had never run, if we had stayed, if we had bowed our heads and let our truth rot inside the walls of that convent. And I realize, silence would have killed us, not in one blow, but slowly, in sighs, in prayers choked back, in dreams turned gray. And it reminds me, every act of truth is an act of survival. Every story told is a defiance of the grave. There are still churches that will not let me speak. Still priests who turn their eyes away when I enter a room. Still corners of the world where power clings to its mask. But I don't need their welcome anymore. I don't need their permission, because the sanctuary we built with our hands, our scars, our unyielding hope, it stands, and it welcomes everyone. I am nearing the end of my years. My steps are slower, my voice softer, but my spirit is not diminished. It has only deepened, like water that once ran wild, now becoming a well. I spend more time watching than speaking now, and what I see is a generation rising that will not be quiet. Women who never met Eleanor, Joy, or Martha, but speak their names like prayers. And I know they will carry this forward, because what we built was not a rebellion, it was a resurrection. There is a particular ache in being the last one left, a weight that presses into your ribs like time itself has made a home there. Some days I wake up and forget for a moment that Joy is gone, that Martha's laugh will never echo down the hallway, that Eleanor won't burst through the door with a page clutched in her hands and eyes bright with fire. But then the morning settles in, and I remember. I am the keeper now, the last flame, the archivist of a truth too sacred to be forgotten. I've grown used to being called strong. Survivors are often praised for their endurance, but they rarely speak of the loneliness that lingers after survival. They don't tell you how it feels to sit in a garden full of healing and still long for the voice that once planted the first seed. They don't tell you about the guilt of outliving the people who saved you. But I feel it, like a second heartbeat, quiet and constant. There are rooms I no longer enter, the one where Eleanor used to write, the alcove where Joy taught Sarah to sing, the small attic where we hid the first night we escaped. They've been left untouched, not out of fear, but reverence, like small altars of memory. Sometimes the younger women ask me what those rooms were. I tell them, places where God whispered to the broken and dared them to believe they were whole. I've kept all the letters, every one of them, stored in boxes, wrapped in ribbon, categorized by year. Some are smudged with tears, some are written in shaking script, some are angry, some are grateful, but they all carry the same thread. Thank you for telling your story. Because now I can tell mine. I plan to donate them, one day, to an archive, a living witness to what happens when women are no longer afraid of the sound of their own voices. There's a photograph on my nightstand. The 5 of us, taken just weeks before we fled. We're standing in the convent garden, smiling, unaware of what was coming. I look at it every night before sleep. Not out of mourning, but gratitude, because we didn't know then that we'd have to burn down the life we thought we'd chosen. But we did. And from the ashes, something sacred grew. My body is slowing down. I feel it in my bones, in the way my breath shortens when I climb the stairs, in the heaviness of my hands when I try to write. But my mind is sharp. My memory is a cathedral now, each moment, a stained glass window lit by grace and grief. I write as much as I can, not for legacy, but for clarity. Because soon, someone else will have to carry this. Sarah has taken on more and more of the work. She's radiant in her role. Part mentor, part protector, all heart. Sometimes I catch her watching me the way I once watched Eleanor. Worried, reverent, unsure. I tell her, I'm not afraid. That dying is not the end. That I've already lived through one death and found resurrection waiting on the other side. She doesn't always believe me, but she tries. That's enough. I've started dreaming of the convent again. But not the terror, not the walls closing in. I dream of the early mornings, mist rising, the sound of birds, the hush before anyone spoke. I dream of Joy singing in the courtyard, of Eleanor scribbling in a notebook, her lips moving silently, of Martha lighting candles. These dreams do not haunt. They hold. They soothe, as if memory itself is preparing me for what comes next. One night, I woke up and walked into the chapel alone. I sat where I always do, and for the first time in years, I prayed out loud. Not for justice, not for peace, but for presence. I asked God to stay near, not because I feared what was coming, but because I wanted to be seen as I crossed over. I didn't want to disappear unnoticed. I wanted someone, heaven perhaps, to remember the girl who ran and lived. And in the silence after my prayer, I swear I felt it. A warmth, a breath, not quite wind, not quite voice, just presence, like the hands of my sisters resting on my shoulders. And I knew, when the time comes, I will not go alone. There comes a moment when you stop counting time forward and start tracing it backward, not in regret, but in reverence. I've been waking earlier lately before the sun has made its promises to the sky. The house is silent, the world not yet breathing, and in those hours, I sit with my tea and remember, not just events, but sensations. The chill of a convent floor in winter, the smell of damp pages in Eleanor's room, the exact note of Joy's laugh when she was startled into joy. These things live inside me now, more vivid than the news, more lasting than pain. The body prepares before the soul does. I've felt it. My steps have shortened. My appetite has waned. But it's not illness, it's invitation. Like something beyond the veil has started to hum, gently, patiently, reminding me that there is more, not as reward, not as escape, but as continuation. The story does not end at the edge of breath, it spills over. Sarah has noticed. She tries not to show it, but her eyes linger longer when I walk into a room. She brings my favorite foods, even when I leave them untouched. She smiles more, not because she's happy, but because she's trying to anchor me here. I let her. Because sometimes, love means pretending we don't see the storm cloud just yet, even as we start folding the laundry a little faster. I've been writing letters, one for each woman who built this place with me, and one for Sarah. They're not elegies, they're not apologies, they're blessings, fragments of memory folded like prayers, wrapped in stories only I remember. When I seal them, I do so slowly, pressing the envelope closed with the same care I used to fold my habit each morning. Sacredness, after all, is in the intention. One night last week, I lit every candle in the chapel. No one else was there. I played the old hymn Sarah once sang after she found her voice again. I didn't pray. I listened, and in the flicker of flame, in the rise and fall of the melody, I felt it, the veil growing thin, like something or someone was on the other side, leaning close, not demanding, not calling, just waiting. I no longer fear death. I fear being forgotten. But even that fear has begun to fade, because I see the women who come here, some only for a season, others who stay, and they speak our names without shame. They build on what we started. They speak truth with less trembling. They run toward freedom, not from harm. And I realize, we were never just survivors. We were seeds. I visited Eleanor's tree yesterday, sat beneath its branches and read one of her poems out loud. The wind responded in soft rustles. The sun warmed my skin like memory. And I thought, if this is the last thing I feel on this earth, it is enough. It is more than enough, because what more could I ask for than a life rebuilt from ashes, and a place where others can do the same? The nurses say I am strong for my age. I don't tell them strength is not lifting, not walking, it's staying, it's remembering, it's waking up every day, with a story that burns in your bones, and deciding not to let it die. Strength is showing up anyway. I've done that. I've done it for years, and now, I'm allowed to rest. There is no fear now, only tenderness, like the world has wrapped me in soft hands, and whispered, "You may let go when you're ready," and maybe I will, not today, but soon, and when I do, I will not be running anymore. I will be walking slow, sure, open-eyed, through a door that opens without sound. And on the other side, I believe they will be waiting. There is a peace that comes when you no longer need to explain yourself. When your story has been told, when the silence has been broken, when the truth stands steady without needing your breath to hold it up. I find myself sleeping more now, not out of illness, but permission, as though every hour of rest is a small returning, a soft descent into the hands that first made me. The nurses keep watch gently. They whisper instead of speak. They leave the windows open, just a crack, so the breeze can carry the sound of birdsong into my room. I notice everything more vividly now. The way sunlight lands on my pillow like a blessing, how the air smells faintly of lavender and soil, the scent of the garden where Sarah waters the wildflowers I'll never see bloom. That too is a kind of beauty, to plant without needing to witness the blossom. Sarah sits with me in the afternoons. She reads aloud sometimes, letters, scripture, fragments of Joy's journal. But more often we sit in silence, not the awkward kind, but the sacred kind. The kind that speaks. Sometimes she holds my hand, and I feel her strength pulsing into mine, like she's pouring all the years I gave into one long silent thank you. And I want to tell her, you were the reason I stayed, but she already knows. A few nights ago I dreamed I was walking through the convent again, but this time it wasn't dark. It was filled with light. The halls had no shadows. The bell tower rang like laughter, and I saw them. My sisters, not as they died, but as they lived. Eleanor with ink-stained fingers, Martha planting rosemary. Joy spinning in the sun, and I felt no sorrow. Only belonging, as if heaven had borrowed memory, just to remind me what waits. I've asked that no grand ceremony be held when I go. No funeral with gilded words or heavy robes, just a gathering in the garden, some candles, a reading from Eleanor's poems, a song from Sarah, and the wildflowers I asked to be planted around the tree. Let them bloom unannounced, let them speak for me long after I am gone. There is a journal beside my bed now. It holds my last thoughts, written with a hand that trembles more each day. But the words are clear. They speak of courage and cost, of silence broken and sanctuary found. They speak of women who walked through fire and became light themselves. I hope someone reads it one day and feels less alone. The world continues outside my window. Children laugh, cars pass. The garden hums with life, and I smile, because this is how it should be. Grief is not a darkness to be feared. It is the shadow cast by something too radiant to last forever. And love, real love, always leaves a mark you can feel, even in its absence. When I can't speak anymore, Sarah will speak for me. When I can't walk, she'll plant in my name, and when the last breath comes, I will not fight it. I've done my fighting. I've carried the weight. I've sung the unsung song. Now it is time to become the silence that heals, rather than the silence that hides. If I had one thing to say to the world before I go, it would be this. Believe the ones who tremble. Listen to the voices that were once quiet, and never confuse obedience with holiness. Truth is the holiest thing there is. And with that, I rest. They found me at dawn. Peaceful, they said, eyes closed, hands folded over my chest, as if I had simply drifted into another room. There was no struggle, no chaos, just stillness, like a candle that had burned to its natural end. Sarah was the first to arrive. She didn't cry at first, she simply knelt beside the bed and placed her forehead to my hand. A silence passed between us, not empty, but full of every goodbye we never had to say aloud. The house moved slowly that morning. No one raised their voice. The coffee brewed in reverent quiet. Women passed through the hall with eyes lowered, hands clasped, as though something holy had passed through and brushed them on the way out. And perhaps something, for even in death, we leave behind vibrations, a warmth, a truth that lingers in corners and doorways. They buried me in the garden, beneath the tree Eleanor loved. No stone, just a wooden marker with my name carved by Sarah's hand, and beside it she planted wildflowers, seeds given by the girl who once whispered that they bloom where no one expects. I believe that's where I bloomed too, in unexpected places, in broken soil, in silence turned song. At the memorial, they didn't speak of my suffering, they spoke of my staying, my surviving, my laughter that returned slowly. The stories I told, the ones I left behind. They read one of Eleanor's poems, and when the woman returns to dust, may the dust remember the fire. That line was the last thing to echo across the garden, before the wind picked it up and carried it off. Sarah took over the center. She leads with gentleness and steel. Every so often, she brings newcomers to the tree. She tells them about me, not as a saint or martyr, but as a woman who walked through fire and didn't lose her name. She tells them, this is where she rests, but her voice still moves through this place like breath. And I do, not as a ghost, but as a foundation. Letters still arrive. Some addressed to me, unaware that I am gone, and Sarah answers them. She writes, Grace can't respond right now, but she read your words with her whole heart. And maybe, in some way, I do. Maybe heaven lets the departed lean close sometimes, just to remind the living that they were heard. The rooms remain. The chapel still holds its quiet light. The garden grows more wild each year, unruly and sacred. And on summer evenings, the women gather with candles and songs. Just like we once did, their voices rise, not in mourning, but in promise. They sing not of the past, but of the future we dared to make possible. If I could whisper one last thing into the world, it would be this. You are not what was done to you. You are what you chose to become afterward. And if no one has told you today, your voice matters. Your story matters. Your breath, even ragged, is holy. Don't let the world quiet you. Don't let the storm convince you you're not the sky. I leave behind no empire, No fortune. Only this, a garden, a name, a chorus of women who now believe that silence is not safety and truth, when spoken, can resurrect the dead. I was one of them once. And now, I am free.